One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett and welcome to the summer series of Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. Over the summer, we're revisiting some of the best and biggest stories from our live events and webinars this year. In today's throwback episode, we speak to Craig Reucassel about his TV show, The War on Waste. He was in conversation with Nina Gbor.
So I'm Nina Gbor. I am the director of the brand new Circular Economy and Waste program of the Australia Institute. It's a program that focuses on research, solutions, and policies for holistic circular systems within Australia. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Craig Reucassel. He is the presenter and producer of the War on Waste series. War on Waste is an award-winning ethical and environmental series of the ABC. So Craig Reucassel is an Australian writer, comedian, and documentary maker who's best known for his work with The Chaser and for going through your bins on War on Waste. If you've seen the series, you'll be familiar with that. Craig and a group of university students, now this is how he started, a group of university students founded the Chaser newspaper, which led to a number of ABC TV Chaser programs, including The Election Chaser, CNNNN, The Chaser's War on Everything, and Yes We Canberra, The Hamster Wheel, and the satirical consumer affairs show, The Checkout. Now in 2017, 2018, and 2023, he presented the multi-award winning ABC TV series, War on Waste, which is what we'll be talking about today. In 2020, Craig presented the ABC TV climate documentary series, Fight for Planet A, and Big Weather, How We Survive It. He was the director of the feature documentary, Big Deal, Is Our Democracy for Sale? Now, on to today's focus. So 7 years ago, the ABC's groundbreaking War on Waste series firmly placed the nation's attention on Australia's waste issues and solutions. So it sparked local and national systems change in the country. And this year, the award-winning series returned with a new season highlighting how far Australia has come in the war on food, plastic, and fashion waste. The new season investigated recycling in Australia, brought to light new waste topics, challenged the lack of corporate accountability towards their own waste, explored what government can do to curb the waste tide, and also, very importantly, the season provides straightforward solutions to help us all shift the status quo with Australia's waste crisis, because it takes a village. Now, so season 1 aired in 2017, season 2 aired in 2018, and after 5 very long years, the first episode of season 3 aired on July 25th of this year. So, Craig, since the second...
Hello, Nina.
Hi.
Good to be here.
So since the second season in 2018, have we lost momentum in our recycling and waste management in Australia? Where are we at right now in general?
I think that, look, one of the reasons we left a bit of a gap, I mean, apart from the fact that we wanted to do a climate kind of series, is that we kind of needed some things to change. So there's been some positive changes. There has been a lot more investment in kind of infrastructure in Australia. There's been, when China kind of closed borders to a lot of recycling, it suddenly pushed it back into Australia. And we didn't realize, we've been just sending stuff overseas, not really having much care about what happened to it. And so we're in a kind of transitionary period at the moment where we're kind of going, oh, hang on a second, we've got to try and deal with this bit of waste, and can we do it, and what do we have to build, and that kind of stuff. So there's been positive steps forward, but there's also, in some cases, there's been negative steps. I mean, fashion's, I think, an example of that, where consumption and the speeding up of consumption is kind of outpacing the advances. So look, it's a story of pros and cons. There's definitely been some definite steps forward. I mean, in terms of food recycling and stuff like that, it's been a lot of steps forward. So we're not just going backwards, I'd say.
That's good news, considering the situations, let me put it lightly, that happened within that 5-year space. Now, I think to kind of start off properly, I think we should look at what's on everybody's mind, right? Which is recycling. And specifically, want to talk about Red Cycle. So, deservedly, they copped a tremendous amount of anger, for stockpiling and failing to, recycle soft plastics as they were supposed to. And, about more than 5 million pieces of soft plastics were being dropped off at supermarkets, around 2019 and prior to that. And, we know that soft plastics come from fossil fuels. Plastic comes from fossil fuels. So considering all of this, in your opinion, do you think that instead of placing so much blame on Red Cycle, not saying they weren't to blame, but instead of placing so much blame on Red Cycle and their unsuccessful business model, should our collective focus and energy, should it have been placed on us, maybe perhaps how we neglected to slowly phase out soft plastics from the get-go?
Okay, I'll do that in 2 stages. I guess let's start with the kind of Red Cycle side of things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of the narrative when Red Cycle fell over was it was just, 6 mums around a table trying to solve a problem. That's not exactly true. I mean, they were working with very large supermarkets. Not only that, I mean, when you look at the actual system there, APCO, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, has the Australasian recycling label. So if you go to your supermarkets nowadays, you see on lots and lots of packaging labels telling you where to take your soft plastics to. And they put things on the soft plastics all around Australia, billions of bits of soft plastic, saying, take this back to the store. So they basically took the Red Cycle system and made it an official part of our recycling system in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
They did that at the same time, though, that they didn't actually, it would have taken them 2 seconds to realize that if everyone took that soft plastic in, there was no way they could process it. They didn't even look into how much soft plastic was being processed. So it's a really neglectful system on a lot of different levels there. I'm not saying the supermarkets knew exactly what was happening. There was a bit of, unfortunately, not everyone knew. And unfortunately, Red Cycle, it would have been a great story if they'd taken people on the journey of what was going wrong. If they'd said, hey, look, we're losing the capacity to do it. There's no market for this. We need to build that, because that's what needs to happen to actually change it. Government needs to be coming in a more proactive role to actually change that situation and helping to create the markets and helping to ensure that that stuff's getting properly recycled. As to the second part of the question, should we have just kind of not worried about Red Cycle and the recycling stuff and just been focused on the phasing out of plastic?
I mean, sorry, let me correct you there. I didn't not worry about Red Cycle, but kind of while Red Cycle's happening, on the other side of things, slowly phase out.
Absolutely. Well, look. I mean, it's interesting the question of phase out though. Phase out's quite interesting because if we talk about phasing out coal and gas, I would go, yeah, that's absolutely, because we have the solutions there. We have renewable energy as the solution, so we can. We're in the middle of a difficult process of phasing it out.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems with plastics is I don't think we're even at phase out stage. So right now, I think we're at the stage where we need to fundamentally massively reduce how much plastic we're using. We're constantly increasing putting plastic into the market, in a lot of cases where it's unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
There are cases where plastic has a role, increasing food life and that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, there's a lot of stuff that's there that has very little role. So we need to be reducing that. We need to be massively increasing recycling. If we're going to be putting plastic into the market, we have to have a proper system where we can start to get some kind of circularity to it. At the moment, it's predominantly virgin plastic, dig it out of the ground, turn to plastic, use it once or twice, maybe for a couple of minutes, and then landfill it, or just as bad, burn it. So we need to be fixing that recycling. But when it comes to that question of phasing it out, I spend so much time looking for the solutions where we go, we can just get rid of plastic, right?
Yeah.
Things like bioplastics, which are often put up as solutions, are really complex. Sometimes they're better, sometimes they're worse. If I'm cutting down an enormous forest to plant corn to turn into bioplastics that I'm then going to use for 1 second and throw out in the same way, it's not an advance in any way. So if I
not to mention PFAS and
exactly, and all this kind of stuff. So it's the question of a phase out is different. We need a lot more research going into that, and there's an enormous amount of that done. There's an article today about University of Queensland looking into have plastics that will break down in the ocean within 1 month. But I've seen these kind of articles now for years and years on end. So I no longer get myself so enthusiastic to go, hey, there'll be no plastic in a few years, which is why, yes, we need to focus on what can we do to phase it out. But in the meantime, we really do need to focus on reducing it and and where we need it or where it's going to be part of the system, making it so it's actually recycled. Our current plastic recycling rate in Australia is about 13%, fundamentally not good.
Okay. Now there's so much confusion about, what plastics are recyclable, to the point where a lot of people get into the habit of wish cycling, right? If anyone's not familiar with the term of what wish cycling means, it's basically when you throw something into the recycling bin, hoping that it can be recycled. And most of the time, or a lot of the time, it probably can't be recycled, right? So that's wish cycling. And of course, councils all have different standards and rules for what can and can't be recycled. And to add further to the complexity and the confusion, companies like to put pseudo recycling symbols, with a triangle on their plastic products, which often don't mean anything to the consumer. Or even like in the series when you had Cotties with a plastic container that could not be recycled, absolutely could not be recycled, but they said it could be recycled anyway, right? So my question is, in one of those episodes, you spoke to the Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek about addressing the issue of recycling and labeling and having a single harmonious recycling standard and system. Is there one being developed for the country? And if so, how far away are we from having this?
Look, there's a couple of things happening on that front, I guess. There is a lot more talk about product stewardship going on, but that's how much that's actually kind of happening is kind of questionable. So that's one of the main reasons that we focused on things like the Cotties example or the example of green PET bottles, your Sprites and that. And the reason we focused on those is often there's this blame put on us putting ours in the wrong recycling bin or on the councils, and by that point, it's too late. If it hasn't been designed properly in the beginning to be recycled as part of a whole system that's been created by government and business, it doesn't come down to us. I can't save that at the end. So that's why I focus on that. So there is this more talk about product stewardship and putting more pressure on the designer stuff. We tend to take an approach in Australia that tends to be voluntary rather than mandatory. Tanya Plibersek has been talking about mandatory rules in some areas, and I think we really need to go to that because at the moment, voluntary rules predominantly don't necessarily work. There's also a big study going on about the harmonization of kind of council recycling, because one of the things that just drives us nuts on the show is that we're doing a national show, right? So we want to be able to give people answers. And most of the time we can't even do that because it's like every council is different because they've got a different waste provider who do a different thing, goes to a different MRF. So you've got to kind of harmonize the system so you can have actually national education systems and then people will be better educated. So yeah, look, there's some steps forward in that case, but it's very slow and not generally mandatory enough is my particular opinion on that.
Yeah, it's a shame that a lot of particularly big business, they prefer the carrot to the stick.
They love a bit of carrots.
They love the stick.
They love the promises that they're doing something about. I mean, and this is it. Look, I'm not behind. There are some companies that are doing the right thing and are actually trying to find alternatives here. And what I hate about the current system is that it punishes those companies.
Yeah, true.
It punishes the people that are doing the right
thing.
Because they are spending more and investing and trying to find solutions to that kind of stuff. And then you go, okay, well, you're doing that good stuff. So what we'll do is punish you by making sure that your competitors don't have to do anything of the same sort. So it's a ridiculous approach.
Wow, we have to change that system. So how much? Let's talk about fashion. Right. So a bit of a plug for myself. I was on the fashion episode with Craig. If you haven't seen it, I recommend watching the 3 episodes.
That's part of the episode.
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing about you, Craig. You have your own personal style, whether you like to acknowledge it or not. You like to say you're not into fashion. And I don't believe anyone should be into fashion. I believe everyone should be into personal style because fashion is wasteful. Personal style is not, right? But you have your own personal style. You know yourself, you express it. So my question to you is that, with your penchant for rocking the legendary plaid shirts that you do, at what stage of career did you fall madly in love with plaid shirts? And also for anyone who wants to develop their own signature personal style like you, where should they shop? How can they do it?
Look, don't ask me for style questions. It was entirely an accident because when the first War on Waste was being made, I mean, I there's no budget for clothing. I'm just wearing my own clothes.
Yeah.
But most of my clothes are even too bad to wear on television because they just got holes in them and stuff. So literally, I just had a few plaid clothes things left over from probably the checkout in my cupboard. So I wore those just because they were kind of the only thing I could wear on screen. And then the thing I loved about that is that you can get great, really cheap things at op shops. Like it's one of those things I reckon I love op shopping for these shirts. You get them so ridiculously cheap. So that's the reason. It's simply because there's
you know
no,
what
no budget otherwise. It's just what it is.
Yeah. You know what fascinates me about your op shopping? How you manage to find the same type of shirts over and over again.
You know, it's very funny. It is funny. That's the other funny thing about them is they do all look the same. And I'm often changed to shirt. Like there's shirts in series 1 that look exactly the same as my shirt now, and it's definitely not still the same shirt. But
listen, Craig, I've been op shopping pretty much my entire life, right? And I rarely find the same thing twice. But I don't know how you manage to do it. But hats off to you.
Yeah, I'm just lucky. I mean, the thing about op shopping is great, but it's also interesting because I think op shops can also like. The only problem, and I love them, I'm not criticizing op shops, it's not their fault in a sense, but what they sometimes do is create this situation where you say to people, you know, you dispose of a lot of like clothes, you throw them out, and they go, no, I don't. I just give them to an op shop. But of course, op shops cannot deal with the amount of clothes that are dumped on them. Like, so they deal with, you probably sell about 16% in Australia. They sell some overseas, but they can't deal with it. So that kind of perception of, it doesn't matter how many clothes I buy new because in the end I can give them to an op shop and they'll deal with them is unfortunately the kind of wrong incentive overall.
It absolutely is because you know, like you said, op shops only sell about 16% of items, and globally we're manufacturing about 150 billion garments a year. You know, this is on a planet of only 8 billion people, so it's not surprising that 87% of the clothes manufactured every year end up in landfill, right? If not here, then poor countries in the global south in landfill there. So yeah,
exactly, it's a nightmare.
So yeah, I was regarding that. In Australia, you know, we import about 1.42 billion garments a year in Australia, and we're 26 million people. So 2/3 of that ends up in landfill, which is around over 200,000 kilograms. And all these statistics I just mentioned makes us the second biggest consumer of fashion and textiles in the world per capita, right? So what, in your opinion, would make the biggest difference in eliminating our clothing waste crisis?
Yeah, it's a tough one. You know, as you know, you and I probably disagree on this. I would just deconstruct the entire fashion industry, basically. like the problem, in a sense, is that there's an enormous industry in the world that has enormous power and influence and advertising power, and that essentially just promotes the churn of clothing. You know, it's a change, and the fashion has changed, and go to something new.
Yeah,
and that's what the major problem is. So if you look at it, you know, we're increasing so much how many clothes we're making, but our utilization, how often we wear them, is going down and down and down. So it's that kind of churn that's the problem. And it's interesting because when we were doing this show, like when we talked to people on the streets, you know, people were spun out by the idea that nearly 2/3 of our clothes are now made by plastic, by fossil fuels, you know, nylon, polyesters, that kind of stuff. So people are spun out by that. But when you say that to people, they want it to be, they want the answer to be, it's okay, I buy cotton, or it's all right, I buy wool, right? And that's not really the answer there, because energy use is worse if you buy nylon and polyester, and bizarrely enough, third is wool. But water is way worse if you're buying cotton, and emissions-wise, wool is worse than the others as well. So the story we wanted to, bizarrely, hemp is the only thing that seems to be good on all those fronts, but it's 0.1% of the global market. So you're going to struggle to get a lot of hemp clothing out there. But so it's not really about going, well, if I just buy the right clothing, it'll solve it. If I buy the one that's made of this or made of that, they've all got their own kind of footprint on the environment. So the real message is about extending the life of those clothes. And how do you do that from a kind of policy perspective? It's hard. I mean, you do see in some countries trying to really put in place incentives for repair, because often nowadays, you know, it costs more to repair a bit of clothing than it does to buy a new thing from, you know, some online brand. So it's, how do we increase the repair incentives? I mean, things like clothes swaps that you do is a great kind of way of getting that social element back into reusing clothes and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Overall, I don't know if you need a price on emissions from the actual clothing or something that kind of, in a sense, ironically, the clothing becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper has meant the value has gone out of it. And because the value has gone out of it, we just dispose of it. So it's becoming the single-use plastic.
It is. So what do you think about taxing the fast fashion companies and ultra fast fashion companies?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you've got to do something to kind of change that market. At the moment, it's just super cheap. And again, it's because our system fundamentally doesn't factor in the costs to the environment. It factors in the cost, it's super cheap to make a piece of clothing out of plastic.
Yeah.
It's not super cheap.
And how much of our clothing is made of plastic, and what impact does it have on our health and the environment?
Well, it's kind of around 60%, just over 60% is made of, and over 50% of our clothing comes from polyester. Now, in terms of health, it's an interesting thing. Like when we did the experiment, the worst part of the show for me personally was analyzing the microplastics inside me.
Yeah.
And the thing I was most surprised about at the time, because I thought it would be kind of all from, I don't use water bottles, but I thought it would be from kind of water in your packaging kind of thing.
Yeah.
But most of the microplastics we found inside me were threads, clothing microplastics. And that's the case in a lot of cases. I mean, when you look at the sediment on the bottom of the ocean, that kind of stuff, there's a lot of microplastics from clothing, that kind of stuff. So it's entering us, it's entering our system. Now, I don't actually want to freak everyone out because we're at a very early stage in terms of the health effects of that. And in many ways, that actually freaks me out more. The fact when you're interviewing scientists and they say, look, we really don't know the answer to that yet, you're like, what? You've got to have the answer. But there are a lot of concerning suggestions of what may be the impact of that. And it's not necessarily just the plastic, but enormous amount of chemicals that go into making plastic. There might be a problem. There's some studies showing that plastic carries bacteria, for instance, that might cause problems. So it's a question of the current amount of microplastic in me. I'm not freaking out, but we're seeing an accumulation of it in the environment, and that's going to continue unless we actually find some kind of solution. So it's not positive. It's not a positive story.
Yeah. So let's move over to food as quickly as possible before we go into the audience questions. So in this recent season, we also learned that, Australia sends 7.6 million tons of household and commercial food waste to landfill every year. And with households throwing away on average $2,500 worth of groceries annually. That's per household. Okay. Now that's 1 in every 5 shopping bags that are dumped. So I was really shocked. Personally, I was really shocked to learn that the concept of eating leftovers is foreign to some people. They even think it's gross. So how can we shift this mindset and culture with, some Australian households who have this mindset to help reduce food waste?
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are areas of this kind of waste problem where you go, look, I can't fix this. I'm not in charge of manufacturing plastics in Australia. That's up to government business. Food waste is an interesting one because still a lot of it does come through households and is actually kind of somewhat linked to our behavior. So that's why we laid out the 500 kilograms of food or half a ton of food, which is what the average family of 4 throws out in a year. So look, the first step is trying to eat it. And that's about buying less in the first place. Better. I think the best tip I learned personally in terms of that kind of stuff through the show is the kind of the use it up shelf or a box in your fridge that you put everything that needs to be used first into that kind of thing.
That was pretty cool.
We've been trying that, and that works to a point, but it's also, it's buying, shopping with purpose. It is eating leftovers. I think most people love a leftover, like a leftover.
I mean, why not?
Often better.
Leftover pizza, leftover pasta. What's not to love about it?
Exactly. It's better flavor in it the second day.
Absolutely.
But in terms of, that's the kind of, I guess that's the household side of it. Then there's the part about it is the disposal of it. So even, you're just scraps and that kind of stuff in Australia, you can obviously compost it yourself if you're in a place that can do it, or if you're in an apartment, you can use a bokashi, that kind of stuff. But overall, moving to every council having proper food recycling or FOGO is the way to go. And that can be turned back into compost to go into gardens, or it can be used in creating energy or other things. Like, we're going to need to find numerous solutions for that. But the fact that we put food waste into landfill in Australia, which, because it breaks down with that oxygen, creates methane, very potent greenhouse gas is just one of the dumbest things we do. So it's
Absolutely.
very frustrating. We've had some, there are a lot of policies that are changing that, but we're still quite slow at the moment.
Okay. So it was suggested in the series that farmers should receive tax incentives for donating food that they're unable to sell to supermarkets, mainly, and that's mainly because of, cosmetic standards set by the supermarkets and other similar reasons, right? So given that the supermarkets are the ones setting these cosmetic standards and sell-by dates, which lead to excessive food waste, should they be taxed for food waste? And if your answer is yes, should there be measures in place to ensure that they don't pass the tax burden, i.e. the cost, on to consumers? Because we know that they will.
Well, it's interesting that, it's interesting the presumption that if you had a system where, and there was some attempts to this in the UK, if you had a system where the supermarket had to buy all of the crop, had to sell all of it. So it had to either kind of sell it, or if it was, unusable, turn it into banana bread or something else, or send another thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if it necessarily would increase the cost, because you've got to remember that all of that waste on farms is actually a cost. It's more land, it's more water, it's more energy.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of kind of cost involved in that at the moment. So it's quite a change. As to the second part of the question, can you find a way that the tax burden is not passed on to consumers? I don't think we've ever found a way yet, but the Australian Institute can maybe look into that. But in terms of that interplay that goes on about cosmetic standards, it's a complex one. It really is. Supermarkets would say to me, look, this is what consumers want.
Yeah. And
I don't deny that they would have right now feedback that, what consumers take is a certain type of, banana. But you don't necessarily have a choice to do otherwise. You do in some cases where they have seconds things.
Yeah.
Overall, you don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
But that's because we've been trained over years and years and years to think that's the best.
Yeah.
It would take a kind of untraining. It would take a kind of dialogue with supermarkets and consumers over years to go, hey, this is the kind of waste that happens if we don't put these ones here. Why not get these? And we'll have, it takes that kind of proactive approach. And supermarkets, look, they are kind of torn between two types of consumers at the moment. There's consumers who are looking for the sustainable and environmentally friendly approach. And then there's another part of the consumers who just want the most convenient thing. They want a rock melon that's been cut into tiny pieces, and every single piece has been wrapped in 12 layers of plastic. It's
plastic flavor rock melon.
And it's where, in a sense, you kind of do need some regulation to come in and kind of restrict that, to make it so that supermarkets actually, it's interesting, when years ago when I was talking to supermarkets about plastic bag bans, they were like, we don't mind them, but the government's got to tell us to do them. And then they're like, okay, well, then we'll do it.
Yeah.
Actually, in the end, after War and Waste won, they actually went ahead and did it themselves, because they kind of realized, I think, because the community were pressuring them, they went, actually, there's enough people in the community that want this change to happen that we can probably do it without saying the government's forced us to do it, which I thought was quite an interesting example of a different kind of power dynamic happening there. But yeah, look, it's a difficult one. I think the tax incentives for donating food is a real no-brainer. And France has also gone down the avenue of saying, supermarkets can't dispose of food, which means they have to link up with food charities and that kind of thing. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the results of that. I've seen kind of differing analysis, but there's at least an attempt at a policy level to try and stop this kind of food waste happening.
Sure. And final question, very quickly, because we have to move over to audience questions. What can each of us do to help change the waste crisis in this country?
Good question. I think obviously do the things you can yourself to avoid the waste and to deal with it. We've talked about that enough. I think keeping up pressure on decision makers, keeping pressure up on businesses and governments and councils and that kind of thing. They are actually responsive to it. Like when councils get everyone calling and going, why don't we have food recycling? It does start to lead to help that process. When businesses get, when they kind of, their bananas wrapped in 12 layers of plastic get put online, I think it does help pressure them to go the other way. And I think government particularly, as I said, there is momentum. There is the right conversations are going on about circular economy and about reducing waste and that kind of stuff. But that, your environment minister is always going to end up in a room with the finance minister, and, you need to have that pressure there that from the public to make sure that momentum is continued. So, the Good for the Hood bunch have put together a toolkit. I think you can look at online, a War and Waste toolkit, which has some suggestions of what you can do, but also about engaging with decision makers and emailing decision makers and stuff like that. So have a look at that. But
I think we have the link to the War on Waste toolkit. So if you're Googling it, please Google War on Waste toolkit 2023, because whenever you put War on Waste toolkit, it brings up the one from 2018, which might not be as relevant.
It's less tools. It's got less tools. It's not as good a toolkit.
I remember you worked really hard in putting that together. So yeah, we want the 2023 one that people use. Okay, so somebody is asking, what measures, both carrot and stick, should the state and federal governments take to truly address the problems of textile waste and microplastic pollution from clothing?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Firstly, I guess we kind of touched on the textile waste thing already. You need to somehow change the market at the moment. You need to kind of have some kind of disincentive to continue to go faster and faster fashion. So that needs to be some kind of price scenario that actually comes in there. When it comes to microplastics, it's a difficult one and it's interesting because, again, an enormous amount of our PET in the world is actually not recycled back into a bottle, it's recycled into clothing. So people say, we shouldn't be doing that. Now, exactly. A PET bottle that's recycled into clothing is better than a virgin piece of PET clothing. So it's kind of positive on that front, but it doesn't solve the second problem, which is the microplastics problem. And I've spoken to a lot of people about this. I know there's some experiments going on at the moment at UNSW with enormous amounts of washing machines trying to figure out if you can have filter systems that try and filter out that stuff. We're talking extremely small pieces of plastic, and to have a filter system that can work in your average kind of home is difficult at the moment. So we don't necessarily have that solution at the moment. So it's one of those areas that I kind of bang my head against the wall and don't have the good answer for anyone yet. There's a lot of work going into it.
So you can, it seems everyone expects you to have all the questions. You are Mr. Eco Warrior in Australia. So it's like, if you don't have all the questions, if you don't have the answers, Craig, who's going to have all the answers?
I have the answer. Well, here's a good one, actually, from Frank Eakin.
Yeah.
Should there be an obligation on the part of solar panel importers to ensure recycling of solar panels? And yes, there should. So that's another perfect example of where product stewardship should come in, so that when you buy a product, part of the fee that you pay for the product should be to ensure that at the end of its life, it gets recycled. Now, in Australia at the moment, I'm not going to lie to you, we don't have a great recycling system at the moment. We're kind of a little bit behind. There's some interesting investments going into it. Victoria has banned the landfilling of solar panels, but overall, we're kind of moving in that direction. But, and this is one of the things I think is fascinating, sometimes people tend to use but hang on a second, we're not dealing with the waste of solar panel, to try and argue that we shouldn't be going to solar panels. It kind of becomes this, online, solar panels are really bad for the environment, right? So let me first put that in context, right? So right now we have 6,000 tons, or 2018, we had 6,000 tons of solar panel waste. By 2035, they're saying it'll go to 100,000 tons, okay? 100,000 tons of solar waste. That's a lot, right?
Yeah.
Right now, our coal ash waste, so the waste we get from burning coal, is 12.5 million tons a year.
Whoa.
12.5 million tons. So I've tried to graph this, and you can't graph it because you can't see the solar panel waste next to the coal ash waste.
Yeah.
So if anyone ever tries to use the solar panel waste as an argument to say we shouldn't use solar panels, that's rubbish. Even if on a life cycle, if compared to kind of using coal to using solar panels for 25 years, whatever they last for, and then putting them into landfill, it's still well and truly ahead. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be improving our way we recycle solar panels, because they've got lots of great resources in them. But it's not an argument against using solar.
Okay. I'll let you choose the next question.
Well, I'm just trying to say there's so many here.
There's so many. I don't even know where to go, because some of them we've sort of half answered them. Some of them are just comments.
Is it time for Australia to introduce a tax for the use of virgin plastics? The UK is heading the way, which means that there is an uptake in the recycled plastics industries. And that's from Nicole Fidge. A really good question. It seems to be quite early at the moment, the kind of plastic tax in the UK. But whether it's a plastic tax or anything else, we fundamentally need to change the economics of recycling at the moment. So many, I talk to people all the time who say, I desperately want to make my products out of recycled plastics and I can't get them, or they're too expensive, or they're massively more expensive than virgin products. And as long as we've got these virgin products being much cheaper, we're going to continue to use them. So we fundamentally have to change that. There has to be some kind of penalty. So if you use virgin plastic, you pay an extra amount, and then that gets invested in the infrastructure or creating the market for the recycled product. Because as I said, 13% recycling rate for plastic at the moment, fundamentally not good enough. Absolutely ridiculous.
I mean, I'm definitely product stewardship seems to be the way to go, for a lot of these solutions. So somebody asked this question previously about in the episode with the pharmaceuticals, the blister packs that you so generously gifted back to the pharmaceutical companies. So how far have they gone further than just
it's interesting you say that. So look, they've gone together and kind of a group of them have started talking about it, but it's exceedingly slow. And what they tend to do is they say, like, these massive global companies literally making billions of dollars, and they tend to say, oh, we're looking at new packaging solutions for the future. And I say, great, do that. But while you're doing that, why don't you recycle your current packaging? You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can do both of those things. So and they've been so slow to actually come forward. So the actual massive amount of blister packs that we picked up and took, we found an actual place that can recycle them. We're going to actually have to end up doing a GoFundMe to get those recycling. We're actually about to start that now. Yeah. Because pharmaceutical companies won't even stump up the cash for that tiny amount, for like 1 or so tons that we actually picked up and took to that company. So it doesn't beg it. And that's why, look, in the end, having that pressure from government, I know government's been talking to pharmaceutical companies about product stewardship. Having that pressure from government is essential. But in Australia, that pressure tends to dissipate because, lobbying companies are very powerful. Our government's kind of weak about putting something in place. Watch Democracy for Sale. But that's the problem, is that we have these great conversations and everyone goes, oh, this is great. And then it kind of dissipates a little bit. So here's a question. The National Plastic Plan 2021 details problematic plastics and the need to remove them. Would synthetic turf be seen as a problematic plastic? I'm not sure if it's officially done, but yes, synthetic turf is definitely a problem. It definitely creates a microplastic problem, and synthetic turf should be avoided as much. It's interesting as well, where some of the example we gave of like sugarcane bagasse products having PFAS in them is an example where, unfortunately, this supposedly fantastic solution for recycling, which is taking a food waste product and turning it to packaging, unfortunately has this side effect. And that's where government needs to step in and go, look, again, it's not up to us to regulate PFAS content, for God's sake. I can't do that and sit at home with my little olive oil tester and trying to figure it out. It drives me insane that we have a government that doesn't put in place actual rules. It's known about PFAS in these products for years now and has had a voluntary phase out. It just drives me absolutely insane. So look, things like also putting rubber into put rubber into playgrounds and that kind of stuff. You've got your synthetic grasses. There's always my concern is that then gets back into the environment. So you have to kind of find those recycling solutions and ensure that product doesn't end up getting back into the environment in the long term.
Sure. So, you just mentioned PFAS, and what's interesting is we keep going into this cycle, right? And the interesting thing about us, particularly us humans, is that if we have a product or consume something, if we don't die immediately, we think, it's fine. Never mind if it's going to kill you a slow, painful death in 5 to 10 years because it's carcinogenic or whatever. Now, my question is this. Plastic, when it was first invented in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it solved a lot of problems, right? And it still does. It's very convenient, right? But we know the downside to it now. And there were, I don't know whether it was in the 80s or the 90s, but people were like, we need to start using paper products in place of plastic because it's better for the environment. And then you mentioned earlier the problem of deforestation, right? And so we go back to plastic because it's better than cutting down all the trees, and then back to paper again because it's better. Then we have toxic chemicals like PFAS and so on, and it just goes on and on and on and on. Should there be what I term a 360 ecology check whenever we're creating products or solutions to, you know, no one has a crystal ball, no one can see the future, but should there be some kind of 360 ecology check where we're thinking about, okay, this material that's supposed to be a solution, what's the impact going to be 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line on this environment or other environments on the other side of the world? You know what I mean? Or
absolutely. I mean, whenever we're bringing, this is the same thing we're saying with the PFAS thing is, you know, you expect that your government, who has the money and the research and your CSIRO and that, when new products are hitting the market, they are doing the proper experiments and looking at the whole life cycle of those things and ensuring that they're healthy and that, you know, they're coming to market in a safe way. That's not necessarily the case. You know, from the checkout to these days, I'm always astounded by, we tend to have a kind of put on the market first and we'll check it out later approach to things. So I don't think that's the best approach. One thing I would say with that though, is we have to be cautious of placing an unrealistic expectation on the alternatives. It's like same as I said with solar panels, right? What we tend to have is this thing where people go, oh, hang on a second, solar panels, you know, there's a bit of a waste problem there. You go, yeah, but they're fundamentally massively better than what they're replacing. And that's what you're looking for, something that's better. It doesn't have to be perfect. One of the things I find difficult in the environmental space is this expectation of perfection.
Yeah.
Us living on this planet, we have a footprint. We fundamentally have a footprint, particularly us living in the Western world. We have a large footprint. Thus of us living in Australia have one of the largest per person carbon footprints in the world.
Absolutely.
So the question becomes not, what can I do so I have no effect in the world? How do I massively reduce that? What's the best thing that I can possibly do? And that's really important. And it's interesting, that thing of talking between paper and plastic that you were giving the example there, right? So when we're looking at getting rid of plastic bags in supermarkets, or, you know, what's the approach? What's the best approach for that?
Yeah.
A lot of people would say, you know, in the old days, we used to have paper bags. Why don't they just shift over to paper bags?
Yeah.
And my answer to that was, well, if you actually shifted from single-use plastic bags, like whatever it was, 2 billion or whatever we're using a year, I can't remember the stat, but, you know, let's say we went from using 2 billion single-use plastic bags to 2 billion single-use paper bags. That is fundamentally just as bad, if not potentially worse. You know, it's not as bad on animals choking, it's much worse on a carbon emissions basis.
Exactly.
So the thing that we actually needed to do was change our behavior. And interestingly enough, putting the 15-cent charge on plastic bags led to an 80% reduction in single-use bags.
Yeah.
Now, I know you still see them around. I know it's not a perfect solution, but there was a recent study suggesting that 80% of people now are taking reusable bags every time they go to the supermarket. So what actually happened was we put in place a financial incentive that changed people's behavior towards reusable things. And that's a much better approach. So we're using less things, we're using them over and over and over again. And that's the approach we need to have. So look, it's I'm looking for the kind of, what's the best thing to use for this single-use product? Probably let's not just have the single-use product.
Exactly. Precisely that. Now, I have another question here. What are B corporations and how do they fit into the circular economy?
B corporations are corporations that kind of go through a rating system to show that they're kind of doing the best in terms of climate and all that kind of stuff and waste kind of stuff. I mean, it's great to have that incentive there. It's great to have a way to judge companies' behavior. I mean, I think, if you can become a B Corp company, it's much better. Pressure on companies, even beyond that, to kind of do the right thing is really important. And particularly one of my concerns at the moment is kind of you have companies that say, we're going to be, you know, carbon neutral by 2050.
Yeah.
And they actually have no plan for that, or their plan is based on just buying, you know, offsets.
That's
fundamentally good enough. So, you know,
you said a trigger word. People at Australia Institute hate the word offset.
I know.
They just lose their marbles here. So let's not say that. Okay. So another question is, this is about a food one. What about use by dates? If somebody wants to know, are use by dates set by public health agencies or by the stores? Do you know that?
Yeah, so it's interesting that, because there's I think in the UK they're moving away from use by dates because or best before dates, particularly best before. Use by tends to suggest, you know, there's a kind of reason to not use it past that.
Yeah.
Best before dates, however, tend to just be a kind of suggestion. So in the UK, they're moving away from best before dates because they think it leads to a lot of people chucking out food that's totally fine. So the suggestion is you go to a sniff test on milk rather than kind of best before, because it might be entirely fine by that point. So I think the actual biggest effect of those used by dates and best before dates is actually not on you and I picking it up and throwing it out.
Yeah.
The actual worst effect is that supermarkets require you, for instance, to have a 6-month standard of your use by date. So lots of stuff, again, doesn't get to the shelves of supermarkets because it doesn't have a long enough date on it. And that's a kind of another one of those unseen waste situations we have. So yeah, the more we can move away from them, except in essential circumstances, the better.
Okay. Here's an interesting question for you, Craig. War on waste has been great as an awareness raiser, but the momentum always fades if it isn't maintained. So we have a different government. We have an ABC with at least some security around funding, and the board is in flux. Is it time to pitch a War on Waste checkout mashup show that can appear weekly and perhaps catch a red cycle issue as it occurs rather than long after?
Look, I think that people tend to overstate the importance of the show War on Waste. Like that starts the conversation, and we can inform people to a certain extent. That's not where the change comes from. Change doesn't come from an idiot like me on television. Change actually comes from if an idiot like me on television if people get interested in that, and then they start getting together with groups in their community, doing, activism on that basis, contacting the local councils, being part of a group that's campaigning for change, putting that pressure there, voting against the people who are against it, that kind of stuff. And that's where the change actually fundamentally comes from, trying to make change within the workplace. So look, yes, it does tail off, and we'll try and keep it up as much as we can, but it's the community activism that brings the real change, not the television show.
Sure. That's a good answer. So here's another question. So if to deliver 82% renewable energy by 2030, we need huge amounts of green steel, isn't the only current source of green steel from recycling? And what do you think about recycling more than 50% of vehicles in the transport sector already being the biggest emitters?
Okay, I'm not sure about exactly on the 50% thing. I mean, yes, steel is, you're right. The most green steel at the moment is recycled steel. I mean, there's some fascinating work going on obviously using green hydrogen to create steel, and it has great potential for Australia, hopefully long-term in that front. But yeah, recycling steel is the green steel at the moment. Our recycling rates for metals tend to be much higher than other areas. So, I said plastic was around 13%, steel, and that tends to be around kind of 70, 80%. So we've got much higher and better recycling rates for that kind of stuff. So obviously we need to get that higher again.
Yeah.
Because if we're burying, like, any bit of steel that we bury is bearing enormous amount of resources, enormous amount of energy. I mean, aluminium particularly, aluminium uses, I'm not allowed to swear on this thing, but a large amount of energy to make it. So the more we can recycle those kind of things, and things, it's interesting, like things like your return and earn, your kind of container deposit schemes have increased that kind of recycling rate of those kind of consumer level stuff. But we need to be recycling far more. And again, we need to have those incentives in place to do that.
Okay. Right. So even with the high cost of living currently, people are still following the capital model of buying more clothes, buying Uber Eats. How do we encourage people to move away from this model when the world is encouraging us to spend, even if high cost of living isn't enough?
Look, fundamentally, that is true. Like we have our economy is built on churning through stuff. I don't want to say, if you can make things using renewable energy and otherwise, it fundamentally changes the dynamics of the things we're purchasing and buying. But in the end, the better thing is to buy less. Like the kind of environmental question, the answer to any environmental question is buy less of it and use it for longer generally. So, it may be slightly different in terms of vehicles sometimes.
Yeah.
But really difficult to change that model. And it's interesting when we talk about fashion, Nina, because you go online, there's really exciting things. There's sustainable fashion hashtags. There's, visible mending hashtags and that kind of thing. You look at the amount of people following those kind of things, and then you look at the major fashion brands in the world and how many people follow them, and it's totally out of whack. So I don't have the necessary answer to that, but we need to change those underlying economic models so that we can actually.
It's almost as if we need to change the economic models. I mean, if it's almost like if our economies are built on the growth of the economy is built on extracting materials from the earth, raw materials from the earth, in order to create products, in order to create jobs, whatever, to grow the economy, then that model is just going to continue. I don't know.
But I think we shouldn't equate. I think we should be careful of equating, jobs just with the negative approach. You can have more sustainable growth.
I think
the change we actually have to fundamentally have. I mean, you can, if somebody doesn't spend money on a cheap as shit $7 plastic piece of jeans from China, it doesn't bring the world economy to its knees. It can be spent elsewhere. It's not, let's not.
How about we have jobs that actually fix the planet? More jobs.
Exactly. I mean, if somebody was to repair the current jeans the person is wearing, it also gives jobs.
Exactly.
It's probably higher.
That's a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer, but I don't think we shouldn't equate the thing that, if we're unsustainable, we need to be unsustainable because of jobs. That's not necessarily the truth. I think we need to change that. That is not the truth
at all. I think we have some economists here that would tell you that. Okay, so Craig, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. It's been, as always, you've been amazing.
This was originally recorded on the 14th of September 2023, and things may have changed since recording. This has been a summer series episode of Follow the Money. You can find all the Australia Institute's research and upcoming webinars and events at australiainstitute.org.au. And you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. If you want to connect with me, I'm Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Our producer is Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Hope you're having a great summer. Thanks for listening.